Have You Prayed by Lee Young Lee is an internal dialogue that the poet takes or engages in with himself, where he's sort of questioning his religious faith and ties it into his relationship with his father. In terms of its impact on me, when I read it the first time, I sort of was struck with a feeling of uncertainty in terms of people's place within this world and sort of the guiding forces that we exist. Yet I had a sense of security in terms of knowing that there are always those who will be looking out for you, whether that be your father or other members of your family. And Lee Young Lee uses things like erotima or sort of nature as a symbol to sort of display this message of internal questioning that he has, and he ends up culminating in the idea that no, in reality, it is not some sort of religious force, but rather it's just him, and more specifically, maybe his father within him, that is the guiding force throughout his life. So starting with the first stanza, we see when the wind turns, as you know, the wind, I think, represents maybe his father in terms of as a guiding force throughout his life and sort of inspiring him to do certain things or act in a certain way. We have the personification of the wind through wind turns, which shows that he's giving these sort of nature a human-like element, which means that it's probably more significant than just something passing by in the wind. And he says specifically, "In my father's voice, have you prayed?" I think that that's asking about whether or not, it's not necessarily whether he prayed that day, but it's sort of a reminder about whether or not he has that sort of religious faith within him, that he thinks there is a higher power that exists. And his response to this question is not a yes or no answer, that yes, I have prayed, which would show sort of a piety to religion, but rather it's more nuanced than that. He says three things that he will never actually explain what all three are. He sort of gets cut off. But the first one, he says that he's never finished answering to the dead. And I think that this simply means that it's sort of a comparison to his father in terms of he's always being reminded by his father, he's always being inspired by his father, and he's always sort of being guided by his father. The second thing that he knows is sort of a man is winds and fire. I think that the winds indicate sort of a guiding factor that exists within life, and this could be, when he says sort of a father's voice or a mother's voice, I think that he's saying that the parents that one has are their guiding factors. They are their sort of guides in life that will put them on a particular path. Then we have he changes this, and he changes the number 7 winds and 10 fires, and I think that this is incredibly important because it's not that he's sort of picking a number of how many fires or winds that are within us, but rather he's generating creativity and wiggle room sort of for the reader, in order for them to sort of generate their own sort of understanding of how they relate to this in terms of who are the ones that are the guiding forces that act within them. I think that when he says, "And the fires are seeing, hearing, touching, and dreaming," he's showing that sort of, he's making a comparison in terms of how the senses are so important for people. So fire, the origins of fire, without fire, humans would not be able to live. Fire was one of probably the most important invention that existed in prehistoric times, and he's saying that is so essential sort of to human life, just like the basic senses that exist. And sort of a question that he asks or is he the breath of God, is, I think, maybe him wrestling with the question of whether or not it is sort of God creating man, or is it man who creates man, sort of creating fire, creating these senses, hearing, touching, dreaming, thinking. Then we have in the next stanza repetition of sort of turning and asking. But here he says when the wind turns traveler. I think when a wind turns traveler shows that he's traveling sort of not necessarily in a physical place, but rather through a metaphysical place. Sort of he's traveling throughout life, traveling throughout his thoughts, traveling throughout religion specifically. And so he asks the same question, "Have you prayed?" which demonstrates erotima, sort of the rhetorical questions that exist, specifically repeating that. And we have, again, the repetition. He remembers 3 things, but the 3 things, while they have a very similar pattern or trait, they are not exactly the same. The first one that he remembers is a father's love, and it is certain to anyone who reads Lee Young Lee poems that he does remember a father's love, as that is sort of a motif that is ever so apparent throughout many of his poems. And sort of there's enjambment that exists here between a father's love and is milk and sugar, and I think that he does that to sort of show the importance, but also because he's trying to choose his words wisely in terms of what exactly it makes up, what exactly is a father's love, because it's something that is so diverse and nuanced. So he starts with saying milk and sugar. This is sort of a metaphor for love in terms of how a father can be sweet or caring and gentle to you, which we've seen in many of his other poems. But then he sort of describes a harder aspect of a father's love. He says 2/3 worry, 2/3 grief. And I think that saying 2/3 and 2/3, which would indicate more than a whole, shows that maybe in terms of how fathers act towards their sons is that they try to overcompensate for the love that they give them by being hard or being disciplined, which can potentially be overwhelming, but there certainly is that love, that milk and sugar that exists within parents. Now, he then goes into sort of making a metaphor about how a father's love is about like making bread, and I think this metaphor is particularly important because it shows how it's sort of a gradual process that requires a lot of detail, a lot of ingredients, and sort of a lot of care. Saying that it's something that the dead and the living share indicates that it's something that he can share with his father, as his father has passed away. Now, he says that in patience, that's to endure the terrible leavening and kneading, going back to sort of the bread metaphor, shows that there are difficult parts of being a father. One has to be patient with their child, but at the same time there's wisdom that sort of exists within them, and that's his father sleeping. He's old, gentle, but at the same time very intelligent. Now, in the next stanza, we have the repetition again of "Have you prayed?" and specifically when the wind asks. But this time, he says that he knows it's only me. I think that this is a turning point in the poem because he's realizing that not only is it only him talking to himself, but it's only him that exists within the world, sort of only him that has control over his fate. And then you see sort of enjambment again, which shows the uncertainty that exists for Li Youngli. And he says, reminding himself that a flower is one station. I think that flower is particularly important here because a flower as a plant lives and dies and sort of indicates that life is short in that there's not necessarily a predetermined path that everyone must follow, but that you must make the most of what you specifically have. Then we have a description of basic elements like fire, salt, and breath, which show that there were these things that existed before life, and sort of is a way that Li Youngli rationalizes that there is no higher power that exists controlling him, but it's just me, as he says at the end of this stanza. Then we keep going, we have more enjambment, but he says that my father, in the gowns of the wind, or my father through me, as sort of indicating that it is his father that exists within him, and specifically the lessons that his father has implanted with him are left over, and sort of asking, have you found refuge yet? Are you happy? Is sort of his way of sort of asking, have you prayed? Is have you sort of found your internal motivation? Have you found your place within this world? And then the conclusion that Li Youngli leaves us with is interesting because he says it's strange, as though it's not what his father wanted. Father, as a preacher, would have probably wanted him to adhere to sort of religion, and that's why he's a troubled father. But we have a happy son because Li is happy as he has found sort of he's been able, through wrestling with the question of religion, he's been able to come to the conclusion that it is just him. But the wind with a voice and me talking to no one, I think, is important because it shows that the wind is that sort of guiding factor that exists throughout his life. And me talking to no one shows that he is, in some instances, it's just him throughout the world. And I think that sort of is a very powerful ending, as it shows that, there isn't something that's controlling us or predetermining the way that we live.